Hey everybody, Jeff Oriyama here. Is GraphQL the panacea for agentic AI? Marc-André wrote this piece last month. I'll be reading through it and giving my thoughts and reactions throughout. Let's get started. It was evident that GraphQL would be touted as the ultimate API style for agents. After all, it is one of the only ways we can expect an API style to stay relevant these days. Whether it is the ideal solution to agent communication is a completely different question. I'll tip my cards right away. I was definitely an early believer in GraphQL as the ultimate API style for agents. That hasn't changed. Let's get into Mark's case, though. Okay, here's the first section, the schema. It is true that a schematized API surface, along with introspection capabilities, makes API discovery by agents much more efficient than schemaless alternatives, like reading docs or reading the implementation if they are lucky enough to have access to it. The thing is, GraphQL isn't the only API style with a schema, and some schema approaches are arguably even more metadata rich, like OpenAPI, for example. GraphQL infamously doesn't have a great story yet for schema metadata. Many of us know this GitHub issue number by heart. What Mark is referring to here is issue 300 in the GraphQL spec repo, linked in the show notes. I agree that more expressive schemas are a missing feature of GraphQL, but I'm unsure how agents might change this game. Are descriptions enough? In other words, if you have a convention for annotating fields with descriptions, will that give agents enough for search and traversal of schemas? Okay, let's go on. In the end, I think GraphQL's advantage with the schema is one that has always existed with human interactions. GraphQL's schema and implementation are particularly coupled together in most implementations. That is to say, that it is very hard to expand or shrink the API surface at runtime without having changed the schema at the same time. That's beautiful when compared to approaches where one has to go to great lengths to ensure the API implementation and schema remain in sync. So yeah, I do think GraphQL's schema is a powerful tool, always has been .png. Is it particularly special for agents? I don't think so, or at least not on its own. Okay, on this, I'm not so sure I agree. Schema definition language, or SDL, is pretty terse compared to other schema formats, particularly those expressed in JSON. That terseness can be a very useful property for context engineering in general, and I've seen some very encouraging results in early attempts to vectorize and perform semantic search on GraphQL schemas. The jury's still out on this one. Point taken, though. The query style. This might be the more interesting point. GraphQL's query language allows clients to query an API's surface in a very flexible way, within the bounds of the schema. Flexibility and safety from the schema sounds like a beautiful combo for an agent caller. I do think that's true, and I think this is where GraphQL starts being quite interesting for working with LLMs. Okay, so right away, this isn't what I would have expected. 90% of what I hear about GraphQL and agents has to do with the schema. So the notion that it's actually the query language that makes this a compelling choice definitely has my curiosity. Let's read on. In my book's introduction, I talk about the beginnings of GraphQL and where its true power lies. Here's the quote. GraphQL's, quote, engine, the algorithm that can execute a client's query against a GraphQL API schema, is in fact kind of our own powerful yet complex client-specific server adapter. A GraphQL API can act as these BFFs, but within just one service, because of how decoupled clients can be from how the schema evolves, and how schema developers can add functionality without worrying about adding weight to existing ones, end quote. You might also recall that I often compare GraphQL operations to, quote, client-generated backend resources, end quote. I find this is particularly true when using persistent operations. This lets server developers focus on exposing a set of capabilities without having to build client or use case specific exact implementations, something many of us appreciate at scale. Let the agents cook. Let's push back on this idea for a moment by considering another approach. One could say that for APIs that are internal / where the implementation can be modified by agents, that ability starts losing its beauty. Let's be real, a handwritten API resource for a particular use case is incredibly hard to beat with something more generic like GraphQL. GraphQL was a trade-off between a completely generic resource-based API and having to write tons of specific and hard-to-maintain resources. But do LLMs change the picture here? I think they kind of do, but that comes with many challenges like guardrails and ownership. Who owns those client-specific endpoints? How do we ensure they stay performant and don't affect other operations on that server? That hasn't changed. What's changed is that it would probably be possible to manage writing and maintaining these client-specific resources. One missing point here, from my perspective, is that GraphQL is an open standard. Agents and humans can learn it, it's machine readable, it's statically validated, and it's openly maintained and neutral. Having 1,000 teams come up with 1,000 slightly different non-standard patterns is a problem for interoperability, onboarding, recruiting, external collaboration. It's basically a defining problem of this generation of software development, to be honest, this agentic era. So that's one point that I think is worth noting in this regard. Okay, moving on. The same old trade-off. Could GraphQL's approach still be an appealing trade-off in an agentic world? It appears so to me, at least for now. GraphQL's schema acts as some sort of bounded sandbox within which agents can freely compose queries without going outside the lines. This is a particularly useful property for public APIs, where client agents would never have access to the implementation anyway. For internal APIs, where clients could be trusted to make changes, maybe the previous point is a fair pushback. Maybe LLMs are or will be good enough to write their client-specific API resources. I think this is a bit charitable here. I don't think people should treat any agent as trusted, period. That bounded sandbox is sort of everything here. It's the whole game. Okay, moving on. GraphQL for agents. Anyone who's maintained a GraphQL server for a while knows that safely querying within the bounds of the schema is great in theory. In practice, you're getting paged at 3 a.m. over a catastrophically expensive query that just hit prod. For humans, what usually needs to be done here is relying on persistent operations and analysis of said operations before they are accepted. For effective agent use of GraphQL, I think that needs to be the workflow too. Agents can attempt to register queries where a battery of checks are done. This is the perfect opportunity to introduce human oversight too, perhaps adding an approval step at first, maybe removing it once confidence has been built in the operation checks/LLM's approach to querying. LLMs are good at getting work done, and they'll do it in potentially awful ways. If the API surface is not quite right, we shouldn't be surprised that we receive some weird operations. For example, what if we did not expose a, quote, plural field to fetch items, and an agent requires 10,000 items? You may receive this. And then there's a code snippet here that shows A1, A2, A3, A4, and so forth, and repeats 10,000 times, and it always queries for an item and just passes an ID to each item, kind of a nightmare N+1 scenario. This style of querying can be rejected by your persistent operation workflow, and potentially even feed back into a server-side agent, which could improve the schema to accept similar use cases in a better way. This is, again, starting to look quite close to letting the agent write its own implementations at this point, but I do think the guardrails/workflows GraphQL enables here are quite interesting. This is a really strong point. My recommendation to almost everyone running GraphQL in production is to use persistent queries. But agents are supposed to be flexible, and we can't predict every use case ahead of time. So I don't know what the compromise is. Mark's suggestions here are pretty interesting, actually. It's sort of like a daemon or a loop agent that's creating new operations on the fly within some sort of human-in-the-loop approval pattern. There's a lot of work to do here, so very cool. Is GraphQL the panacea for agentic AI? Not really, no, but it has the potential to be quite good at it. There's much more to be said about GraphQL and LLMs, but we'll leave that for another time. Cheers, Mark. And that's the end of the piece. I think Mark answers his own question by using the word panacea. There are very few panaceas in this world, and precisely 0 of them are in the software realm. Except Vim, the ultimate text editor, of course. I like this write-up a lot. Mark is a thoughtful commentator and a true GraphQL expert. The angle about the query language being the real magic is interesting, and I'm working on some benchmarks that show that the query language helps agents select only the data they need, which keeps token usage down. So that's one potential tangible data point. It was cool seeing schema metadata since 2017, and I have a feeling that agentic development will add more nuance to that debate. Well, that's it for now. Thanks to Marc-André for writing this piece. The link to his blog and socials are in the show notes. See you next time.